and welcome back to the Greenwash Podcast. My name is Sania, and today it's just going to be me, and that's because I have a very important topic I want to talk about. This has been something within the sustainability movement and when it comes to greenwashing and virtue signaling that has its own seat at the table. It has its own section, and I like to call it the fashion interlude with the sparkles and streamers and stars. And that's because when you think of fashion, on this podcast before, we've discussed separate topics. Fashion itself is an entire genre of products. There are fashion products. It encompasses accessories, jewelry, clothing, even shoes will go into fashion. It is its whole subcategory. And that's why I wanted to go over the fashion interlude, just because fashion is such a big section and has so many of its own debates in terms of the sustainability movement. And in terms of greenwashing specifically, I mean, oh boy, is there a lot to unpack when it comes to fashion. And that is kind of what I wanted to do today. Now, when I think of fashion in terms of when we're talking about environmentally conscious fashion, I think of two things. I mainly think of thrifted clothing, and I think of quote-unquote sustainable clothing. And then you also have, on the other side of that spectrum, fast fashion. And the terms in which fast fashion is described are kind of all over the place if you've seen on Twitter and Instagram and social media, and especially TikTok. But what it kind of boils down to is fashion that is produced at a fast rate. So when you do traditionally think of fashion houses or fashion clothing or fashion brands specifically that will produce clothing at such a fast-paced rate and mass produce it on a scale that is unhitherto in a very short amount of time. That's essentially what you get with fast fashion. And the thing about fast fashion is that the usual complaints with it are, of course, the mistreatment of, the people who work to make sure that that fast fashion is quote-unquote fast. These things don't happen overnight. And we still, especially, you think about, let's say, crochet. If you've ever had a crochet sweater, by the way, it was handmade. We still do not have a robotic way to make crochet sweaters. Knitted is a different topic, but crochet sweaters, if you have one and it was from Zara or whatever, that was all made handmade. And there are many other products that fall under that. And even then, even if you have some sort of roboticized process when it comes to fast fashion, a lot of it does involve human labor. And of course, we've all heard the terms that are thrown around, such as sweatshop or labor factory. And I'm sure you've heard of many brands thrown around as well. And I think that there are a lot of brands that don't get mentioned as well, or that kind of just skate the edge of fast fashion. And there are ones that are it's become so intertwined with their identity that people kind of look at you dirty if you've mentioned that you have that brand. And it's the main nemesis when it comes to sustainable fashion or ecologically conscious fashion. It's the villain, it's the white whale, it's the great evil, apparently. But despite, no matter how many people agree on that, the disagreement is how do we tackle this? How do we get over this problem? How do we shift away from it? And we go back to the two forces that I kind of mentioned that have been sort of up and coming as of right now, and not even up and coming, have been prominent for some time and are really getting their moment in the spotlight right now, and that is thrifted fashion and sustainable clothing. So first of all, going into thrifted fashion, thrift shopping has historically been the main practice of people in poverty or otherwise on tight budgets. However, in a rise in eco-conscious thinking and the tempting price tags of secondhand goods, it's caused more people to begin to thrift shop, regardless of their financial situation. So nowadays, you will kind of see people of all economic statuses going into a thrift shop and hunting, because it's no longer become you go to the thrift shop because that's all you can afford. In fact, the change has been mind-blowing to witness, and believe me, there were so many YouTubers I used to watch back in the day who were very much into this thing, and you could almost see the change start to take over the internet, especially in the 2010s, where, and I believe Imani once mentioned on a previous episode how she used to be made fun of for having certain thrifted clothing when she was much younger in elementary school, but now it's the coolest thing, and it's so cool if your entire outfit is thrifted. And the sheer change in mindset we've had in just the average consumer we've had over the past 10 years is really remarkable to witness. It's kind of just described as that both the appeal of the activity and the gold star reputation of being ecologically sustainable has contributed to thrifting's rise in popularity into those who are not confined by their budget to thrift. You have to think about the fact that, of course, when this whole sort of thing of like, oh, we should start thrifting started, it started as we should start thrifting to save money. We should start thrifting to, instead of buying new clothes, you should take clothes out of the dustbin. And then, of course, there was what I would say the real attractive factor of it, which is we should start thrifting because it makes it look cool. When you say you found a piece that was like just perfectly vintage, or like that exact like Juicy Couture bag from like 2005. It's the perfect package of, oh, look how good of a person I am, and also look how fashion forward I am to find this cool vintage unique piece that I'm sure no one has anymore. Never again will you have the problem of like buying a shirt at H&M and oh my god, everyone has it. So that absolutely has contributed. I mean, the sort of marketing that people do around themselves nowadays, just for their own benefit or just for their own happiness, the marketing they do, and like, I want to be the girl who, or I want to be the guy too, like everyone. I want to be the person who will find like super cool, unique stuff. I want to be different from everyone else. That has always been prevalent in fashion, but this is the newest iteration of it. And it was commonly thought of something shameful to be seen in until its resurgence around, once again, the late 2010s as unique and sustainable and as a cool way of building your wardrobe. And then you see it start there, and then you see it start to morph into its own form or its own category of fashion. There is a resale service called ThredUp, which I think any of you, if you've seen someone on YouTube, you might have heard of ThredUp because many are sponsored by them now. But ThredUp is an online thrifting store, so it's not like the most new concept, but they are the most prevalent one as of now, where they are probably the number one online thrifting store, meaning that people will send clothing to them that is meant to be thrifted, and you can buy clothing online instead of having to go to physical Goodwill stores or any sort of thrift store. And according to a report done by them in 2019, around 40% of young adults were buying secondhand, compared to less than 30% in 2016. Now, you think about how big of a shift that is. That's from 2016 to 2019, and you're seeing around almost a 20% increase in the percentage of young adults who are buying secondhand. I mean, that's absolutely one remarkable sort of shift in the psyche of the average young adult consumer when it comes to buying fashion. And fashion is definitely an industry that is most influenced by trends, but it's certainly one thing to remark the trend of not just like, oh, this product is cool, or this brand is cool, or this item is cool, or this style is cool, but to literally reroute a way of buying clothes is something that I think was really remarkable to witness. And the eco-conscious reasoning behind the shift towards thrifting is that buying previously owned stuff keeps products in circulation for longer, making the practice beneficial to the environment. And it's been shown time and time again that buying secondhand clothing is a direct counter to the rise of fast fashion. And it's a form of clothing production that has often fallen under criticism for its lack of sustainability and morality. But its prevalence in today's trending activities, it kind of proves harmful for other communities in the long run. The thing is, the problem with thrifting now is that there are several problems with thrifting now. We've seen the resurgence of thrifting. We've seen the rise of thrifting. We've seen its popularity in many facets when it comes to style and when it comes to saving the planet. However, the absolute popularity it has almost now started, like with many things, it starts to get too popular, and there are certain aspects that will start to backfire on it. I'm sure many of you who are online might have heard of the term Depop seller. And a Depop seller is someone who will take, usually, and this is a bit stereotypical, but they will be stereotyped as usually a young woman who will basically go to thrift stores, and they're usually very trendy, fashion-forward young women who are on top of all the trends, have a mean Instagram, that sort of thing. And they will go to thrift stores, and they will absolutely hunt down the best pieces they can find, or many pieces. They'll absolutely because they have the money to. And they will take many, many pieces, and they will resell them on Depop for much higher, claiming that they're vintage pieces, which a lot of times they will be, but they will take them from the regular affordable price that they were at the thrift store and resell them just to hop on the kind of marketing train that's going on right now around #vintage clothing. And as you can see, they're not very well liked for very many obvious reasons. This is very harmful to communities who used thrifting in the first place before it became this sort of cool thing to do. The people who needed thrifting in the first place were people who were economically challenged, people who did not have the income to continuously just keep buying new clothes. And you see this with so many things. You see this with people buying a lot of plus-size clothing from thrift stores and marking them down to do that. And then you see a second problem. So that was the reseller section. And then you have a second problem, which is that the rise of fast fashion has almost made its way into these thrift stores. It's not that just buying thrift can stop these anymore, solely because there has been a very interesting phenomenon that's been taking place in clothing stores, which is that if you've seen maybe the 45 item so-and-so haul, or the $700, let's say, online store haul, that people will do. They will buy from many fast fashion brands, and because fast fashion brands are cheap, many rich people who like doing these sort of video hauls or remaking their closet every month will buy a honestly heinous amount of clothing. And of course, they can't wear all of it, or they get sick of it, or it tears, because fast fashion is usually not made with good quality materials. That's just an aspect of the clothing. And so they'll go out of style, they will become unwearable, or the person who bought it will just lose interest in it and want to remake their closet again. And they will take all that clothing and they will either A, dump it, which automatically sends this fast fashion to our landfills and into our environment, or B, they will put it in Goodwill. And then they might go and buy nice, sustainable clothing for themselves, which I'll get into later because that's the second part of this whole phenomenon, right? But they will donate all of that clothing to Goodwill right back into poor communities. And then that clothing will be sold for almost as much as it was on that original fast fashion site, or even less. And that means no matter how you look at it, this type of badly made, really cheap, environmentally harmful clothing just trickles its way back down into poorer communities through these thrift stores. And it's a multifaceted problem of you have on one hand resellers buying all of the good quality vintage pieces from there to resell for hundreds of dollars higher. And then you get left with the cheap pieces that were also just handed down from someone's rich $700 closet haul. And it's become a very unique problem that we have now. And it's a catch-22. What are you supposed to do? If you buy directly from these sort of fast fashion stores, you're kind of adding to the problem. You might think that, okay, well, at least since I'm buying it secondhand, it's already bought, it's already been placed out there in the clothing market, it might as well go through another cycle instead of just adding more items to that clothing market. But then you also have to think it's rather unfair. Either way, it's going to be probably just discarded because the clothing is usually cheap and will rip or something like that. And it will just cycle its way back to the landfills. And it's a very harmful process that we're seeing here. And that is the absolute number one complaint that's being put against thrifting right now, is that it's gotten so big that there are now these sort of issues we have with it, which I don't recall seeing these sort of issues with thrifting that we've seen at many other times. Many things had to happen for this sort of situation to arise. The rise of fast fashion had to coincide with the rise of ecologically sustainable clothing and eco-conscious consumerism to create this sort of problem. And it's not even just resellers. In certain thrifting locations within large cities, prices have already begun to rise at a significant margin, putting a disadvantage at poor people who were first considered the target market. It's just a fact. It's become commonplace to see these resellers do exactly what they said they're going to do and buy cheap clothing for bulk and resell them on their website for 3 times as more. This was confirmed by many reports, including one of the most famous reports by Janice Nguyen in 2020 and 2021, 2 reports. Taking all of this controversy into consideration, it has correctly identified the most effective way to reduce clothing waste on the planet, which is simply just buying less clothes. It's not, buying fast fashion at an extended rate and donating all to the thrift store. And sometimes it's not even just buying from the thrift store. If you're going to simply buy as many clothes for cheap as you would in a fast fashion haul. The big problem we're seeing with both of these is that it just employs the same concept. Someone who can very well afford to get more expensive clothes, rather than spending that allocated amount of money on fewer but more expensive clothes, would rather get a lot of cheap clothing for bulk that they cannot possibly wear and then discard it in any type of manner. And that's what's causing the real problem here. And, it seems like a simple solution to just say, oh, buy less clothes. But it's not a solution that many take seriously, considering how the average American today buys 68 articles of clothing per year. So it would have to, that's the real psyche shift that has to go. We've already seen the rise of thrifting, but the real shift, if we want real change, would be to somehow convince the American public to just simply buy less clothes. Now, as I've covered that section, part 2 would be, of course, covering sustainable clothing. Now, on the absolute other side of the scale, while thrifted clothing is known for being something that's more cheap and secondhand, sustainable clothing is something that is quite literally known for being very expensive because it is made out of sustainable material. Sustainable clothing is often hailed as the modern-day solution to basic waste, as it's usually defined as garments that have been made in a way that is mindful of the many environmental issues the fashion industry touches upon. Now, this definition covers a wide range of practices, such as making clothing from fabric scraps left by factories, making clothing from biodegradable fabric, or producing clothing in ethical factories where workers are paid living wages. Sustainable clothing has become a forefront of the war against fast fashion brands and their unethical, wasteful practices, and the promotion of sustainable clothing brands has become commonplace on social media sites. So on one hand, you see many fashion influencers who are promoting sites such as ThredUp, and then you also see many fashion influencers promoting sites such as, let's say, Reformation, which is a very famous sustainable clothing brand, which I'm sure many of you might have heard of. So Reformation has made sustainability their tagline to make headway in the fashion world, and it seems like they're doing a very good job at that so far. The New Yorker described the brand as having a slightly cultish following, which was known for minimalist, insouciant dresses designed for the bodies of models, produced from environmentally friendly fabrics, and mostly priced in the low 3 digits. Now, what a number is that, low 3 digits? But I think that sentence from the New Yorker was very apt in the sense that it very clearly described what Reformation was doing, and not just Reformation, but many quote-unquote sustainable clothing houses and factories. So sustainable clothing is basically just, yes, priced very expensive, as they said there, in the low 3 digits, but any price in that range. And it's because they are made of a more sustainable material, or they're made with more sustainable practices, or all three, and they're just made to last. And the concept is that instead of bulk buying all these cheap things that will break, you spend more money and invest in a clothing piece that will last longer, and something that is known to not cause harm to the environment and all of those sort of things. Reformation has basically made this their tagline, and they have, exactly as described in the quote, developed a slight cultish following. Reformation dresses, and I have seen them, are certainly very nice to look at. They do employ a very classical kind of style, and I do also have to remark that they do not seem to fit many ranges of body types, I will say. But so far, that is what they're doing. And the problem that they kind of have, and that's just arising with sustainable clothing, has become the sheer amount, once again, being purchased rather than what's being recycled. So Reformation, I mean, the reputation or the concept is that you buy less clothing solely because this one will last. Instead of buying 10 dresses to replace the first 3 dresses that broke, you buy one piece of clothing, and that should last you a long amount of time. However, that's not what we're seeing here once again. Reformation has developed a very strong following. You see people who just want to buy as much Reformation as possible and redo their entire closet in Reformation and say, look, my entire closet is sustainable. And that would be great as long as you actually employ the concept and do not keep constantly replacing those things if they are completely fine and appropriate to wear. This, once again, you just see these concepts that seem to be sort of good and something that would be helpful, once again, almost brutalized by our American habit of consumerism, and something that is very strictly, you need to buy as much as possible. You need to fit all the trends. You need to make sure that, it's almost just retail therapy on the largest scale imaginable. And all of these ideas are great, and all of these ideas are good. Thrifting, sustainable clothing, they're great. It's just that they're not being used correctly, because those ideas are meeting with the incessant need that many citizens have to, if they're able to, and if they have the income to to just get as much clothing as possible. Once again, the number is 64 to 68. And now you think about the entire American population, and then you maybe downsize that population to think about who can actually afford to do this. Who can actually afford to buy Reformation when their clothing is described as, quote unquote, priced in the low 3 digits. And that's someone who can not only afford to buy that, but afford to buy that many times over. And because they can, they will, and they are. And that is the number one problem you're seeing with Reformation. Another problem you see with all of this is that since Reformation has almost taken to rise a little bit after the rise of thrifting, you go back to the phenomenon I had talked about, which is people buying a lot of bulk, cheap clothing and passing it down to thrift stores. The reason they pass it down to thrift stores is not only just that they can redo their closet a month later with the newest styles, with whatever's in trend at that moment, but also because of Reformation, and not just Reformation, of course, but like sustainable clothing. The idea has become, oh, okay, I shouldn't do this instead. I should get sustainable clothing. That's a lot cooler. It's more expensive. They're more chic pieces. They're more high quality. And because of that, everything that was purchased during the big fast fashion boom is now being passed down. And that fast fashion boom is still continuing, just at a slower rate. So now you have just an excess of clothing everywhere. And the real issue that we have now isn't even just thrifting. For thrifting, the concept is fine. You just have to make sure that you're avoiding reselling. You have to make sure that people are not being harmed in the process of you getting to claim that you're ecologically conscious. And then on top of that, sustainable fashion is fine. I understand the concept of I want to make sure that these pieces last. These would be, sustainably or properly paid workers, hopefully, and also just better methods of making the clothing. That's all well and good, but you can't defeat the concept by buying 37 items of that and then also replacing them with 37 items more. What this is all leading to is less of a change in what sort of product you should buy or where you should buy it from, but just a shift in how you buy things or how much you buy things. The problem is no longer where do I buy things. You have many places to buy things. You have a low income option for sustainable clothing and you have a higher income option for sustainable clothing. And then you have like the middle ground. The real change will not be when you decide, oh, should I thrift? Oh, should I buy something from a sustainable clothing brand? Oh, should I get this thing from H&M? H&M's claiming they have recycled fabric. It's going to be when you decide how many clothes is enough? How many times can I reuse clothing? And how many times do I have to use this clothing to make up for the amount it's taking up in my closet? That is kind of all I have for this fashion interlude today. It's going to be a bit of a shorter episode, but I will be back next week with people this time. And I appreciate you all sitting here with me today just for a little solo episode, and I will see you next week.